In the Central Sahel, temperatures are rising 1.5 times faster than the global average. Since the 1980s, climate events in the region have been increasingly extreme. Droughts increasingly severe and storms more intense and frequent. In August 2020, the region suffered the most devastating rains of the last decade. Large areas of Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger and Chad saw destruction of homes, damage to health centres and flooding of farmlands. Climatic changes are increasingly frequent along the 5,000 kilometres of the African continent, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. This is known as the Sahel Strip, one of the regions most harshly affected in the world by these phenomena. In the region's central area, climate change is yet another factor of territorial instability, a global threat that adds to the burden of existing poverty, food insecurity, institutional crises, and different types of armed violence and community conflicts. How does climate change affect the safety and development of the Central Sahel? We'll be analysing it in detail. The impact of global warming in this area of Africa is linked to the region's political and socio-economic conditions, and the latter, in recent years, have been conditioned by the deterioration of public safety. The Central Sahel region is a hotbed of armed groups, which proliferated after the fall of the Gaddafi regime in Libya in 2011. These groups are present throughout the region, but the violence is mainly centred around three areas: northern Mali, the Liptako-Gourma border region, and the Lake Chad basin. There are numerous groups involved, but the most active are the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, linked to the Islamic State and the regional branch of Al-Qaeda, the so-called Group for the Support of Islam and Muslims. Violence is spreading from this region to the countries situated along the Gulf of Guinea. These groups thrive on vulnerabilities and discontent towards the states. Their discourse is not only religious, but also social, political, and full of local references. This point is key. In certain areas, armed groups take part in the management of natural resources to win the favour of the population or join existing criminal networks. Climate change is not a direct cause of the proliferation of extremist violence, but its impact does affect food insecurity and economic losses. This can prepare the ground for combatants and facilitate their recruitment. The European Union, France and the United States have deployed military missions to contain the advance of jihadism in the region. But far from mitigating the violence, the foreign military presence appears to have aggravated the situation. The use of armed militias to fight jihadism and repressive military practices by various security forces have resulted in numerous civilian deaths and human rights violations. In addition, violence has left more than 2 million internally displaced persons in the Central Sahel region. Aside from forced displacement, mobility is essential for the population of the Central Sahel. Seasonal migrations are a way of life in this region. Climate impact could increase movements from rural areas to the city and between regions. But certain vulnerable groups will be trapped as they lack the resources to move. Although most population movements are regional and only a small fraction aim to reach Europe, the European Union's border control policies consider the Central Sahel a priority. To understand this, we have to go back to 2015. The European Union was then hit by what was perceived as a migration crisis. There was a drastic increase in the number of people crossing the Mediterranean Sea. Europe strengthened its policy for externalizing borders, placing the Sahel region, a transit area for sub-Saharan migrants, among its priorities. Through a trust fund for Africa, millions of euros were allocated to countries in this region in exchange for curbing migratory flows. Encouraged by this funding, Niger, the epicenter of sub-Saharan transit, passed a law that drastically tightened controls, making regional movements more difficult. Far from being stopped, migratory flows to Europe have been diverted towards parallel routes that involve greater risk of human rights violations and, often, to the lives of the migrants themselves.
Containment policies add more problems internally. They affect livelihoods by hindering mobility. They violate ECOWAS free movement protocols, a kind of Schengen area in West Africa. They perpetuate inequalities and clientelist structure, and in short, aggravate instability in the area. Moreover, European restrictions are incoherent since they claim to promote climate change adaptation, but at the same time try to curb migration, which is a form of resilience to cope with it.
There are more than 14 million people at risk of food insecurity in the Central Sahel. Most of the region's inhabitants depend on agriculture and grazing. In this scenario, land, water, and other natural resources are a constant source of local tensions. These are aggravated by climate change, but the latter cannot be considered the sole cause of conflict. Political aspects also play a part, such as the historical promotion of agriculture over grazing, in addition to corruption or inequalities. The proliferation of weapons and the participation of political elites and armed groups have made these inter- and intra-community conflicts more violent. Torrential rains and extreme droughts can complicate hunger, conflict, and mobility in the region. But the origin of these problems is actually based on the political and socio-economic weaknesses. For the Sahel to be able to face the global challenge posed by the climate emergency, the focus on this context is indispensable.